SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good afternoon, friends and dear students. Today I'm going to talk on the topic activity-based costing. Activity-based costing, the topic which comes for the higher level students, those who are in masters, those who are doing professional course like CA, Chartered Accountant. They learn this topic, activity-based costing. I try my level best to explain this topic in very easy manner. Let us start from the cost components, which are very important to learn before further going for activity-based costing. What actually the product cost is? Before directly going to the activity-based costing, we must have a clear idea that how the cost of a product is ascertained. In conventional manner, the product cost is calculated by way of adding direct material to direct labors, other expenses which are of direct or indirect in nature. The direct material and direct labor is called as prime cost, which are very easily traceable to a cost of a product without any complications. They are easily identified to a cost of a product. Whereas the other expenses, and in that the indirect material, the indirect labor and other indirect expenses are a part of overhead which are not traceable. They are all together and becomes a part of a product. They are aggregated together to get the semi-finished goods, or also called as work in progress. And finally, after further process, we'll get the finished goods, a final product. And this way, we calculate the cost of a product in conventional way or a traditional way. So, traditional way or a conventional way, calculating the cost of a product is little bit easy. This way, we finalize the cost and the employer, the company owner, as per the criteria, they add the profit margin and find out the selling price of a product. Another way, we can also say that these are the elements of a cost: the material cost, the labor cost, and other expenses. Now, which kind of these other expenses are? Material and labor, they are directly used to manufacture our product, whereas other non-manufacturing expenses like selling and distribution expense, office and administrative expenses, they are also becomes a part of cost. Direct material and indirect material are the part of material cost. Same way, the labor cost is also a direct and indirect, and other expense is also divided into direct expense and indirect expense. So, here the indirect part of material, labor and other expense becomes the overhead. Why I am explaining this? Because in next slides we are going to learn what exactly the activity based costing is. So for that, the explanation regarding overhead is very important, and you should know how the overhead is calculated and what are the components of overhead. So let me repeat again: indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses becomes the part of overhead. So what exactly the overhead is? Overhead means the cost of indirect material, indirect labor and such other expenses, including services which cannot be conveniently be charged to a specific product. Now, this is a very important on the part of overhead. As we have seen that material and labor, they are easily traced to the cost of a product, whereas the overhead, the indirect material cost and indirect other expenses are not easily traced to the cost of a product. So what can be done? So for overhead, the proper allocation base is to be found out. Overhead, as it is not directly traceable to the cost of a product, so proper allocation or apportionment base is first to be calculated, and then it is charged to a specific unit, and then a cost of a product is to be ascertained. Indirect labor, indirect material, utilities also becomes the part of overhead. Supplies also a part of overhead. These all are the manufacturing as well as non-manufacturing expenses of a company. As these are indirect in nature and as these are not directly traceable to the cost of a unit, so as I told you that a proper allocation is required for that, and proper allocation base is to be chosen according to the nature of the activity. Now why these are very complicated, why these are very much difficult as compared to the direct material and direct labor? Because direct material and direct labor are directly traceable to the cost object, product. The actual expenses incurred on that is easily known or easily determined, whereas for overhead it is not easily determined, because the overhead expense incurred, that is for the common benefit of all the units produced. As it is for the common benefit of all the units produced, that's why only the proper allocation base is required. The next is, it is very important to run a business. The overhead costs are very essential to run a business. Utilities, then other setup cost, etc. They are very essential and they are common for all the products manufactured. That's why for overhead apportionment is required. Through this slide, we can easily come to know that how the allocation base is done and how the cost allocation and cost tracing is done. Cost allocation as it require in case of overhead. So, there are certain ways or methods to trace the cost directly to the cost object, or let me say that to the product manufactured. Direct, as I told you that direct material, labor are directly traced to the cost object. Let us say that, or for an example, there are 3 products manufactured in a company: product A, product B, and product C. These 3 products are whatever the material and labor expenses incurred, they are directly allocated and traced to these 3 products. Whereas indirect cost or overhead, as it is not directly allocated or traced, so for that there are 2 ways, or let me say that there are 2 methods to allocate indirect expense or overhead. The first way is traditional conventional cost accounting method. In traditional or conventional cost accounting method, as we'll see later on, that only one cost allocation base is to be found out, or the rate is to be determined for tracing the cost to the 3 different products A, B, and C. Whereas the another way is activity based costing. Now you might be clear with this slide that what exactly or where the activity based costing system comes. The activity based costing, here we are looking at the slide, we see that it comes for cost allocation, cost tracing in case of overhead, indirect expense. So, mainly there are 2 methods to allocate, to apportion the overhead cost to the cost object products A, B, or C, either by traditional way or by using activity based costing. Activity based costing, that's why now we are going to learn in detail. So now we'll see from the next slide what actually the activity based costing is. But before that, we also have to understood that what exactly the difference between the traditional cost or the traditional conventional costing method and the activity based costing method. Because until and unless if we don't know the difference, we are not able to arrange or bifurcate the benefits available from implications or applying the ABC costing method. The traditional costing method has one plant-wide rate, like say for an example, mostly the machine hours and labor hours is calculated. So in traditional costing method, only one plant-wide overhead rate is calculated. Whereas in activity-based costing, multiple activity rates are calculated. We'll see later on how we calculate multiple activity rates. Second, as it is only one overhead rate in traditional costing, So it is very easy to implement. Whereas the activity based costing employs so many activity rates, so it becomes difficult to implement. In traditional or conventional costing method, it is directly tracing a cost to a product, it allocates the product cost. Whereas the activity based costing is also called as a period cost. Activity based costing, as it treats or called as the product period cost, it doesn't mean that it cannot include the period, but it may have the allocation of period cost. Traditional costing method is mostly useful for external financial reporting, or it is useful to the external reports. Whereas the activity based costing is not useful for external reports, but it is for internal financial decision making. What is to be done, how the cost is to be reduced, how the cost is to be controlled, what are the ways to reduce and control the cost, how the overhead cost is to be minimized, what are the causes for which the overhead costs are incurred. So this way, the activity based costing is helpful for internal decision making. Other differentiating points are, as only one plant wide rate is there, so the allocation is the apportionment of overhead cost in traditional costing method on the basis of either labor hours